Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Colm Markey. I'm an Irish MEP, a member of the Fine Gael party in the EPP group, and also a substitute on the Transport Committee at European level. So welcome to our webinar this morning, Going Green, Cleared for Takeoff. It's a look at how we can get the renewable fuel sector, renewable fuels effective in aviation. Joining me here today, we have Michael O'Leary, CEO of Ryanair, Dr. Stephen Dooley, Associate Professor of Physics in Trinity College, Dublin, and Damien Meadows from the European Commission, who's responsible for international carbon markets in aviation and maritime. So it's perhaps timely today that we're having this discussion with COP26 going on. Tomorrow in COP26 there will be a discussion about zero emissions from transport, so very timely in relation to that. And equally, from during the summer when the Fit for 55 package was announced, which ultimately has a target of 63% of renewable fuels, of all fuels to be renewable by 2050 in the aviation sector. So that 63% is massively challenging, and I'm delighted to have our guests here, Michael O'Leary, CEO of Ryanair, Mr. Stephen Dooley, Associate Professor of Physics at Trinity College, Dublin, and Damien Meadows from the Commission to discuss how we're actually going to achieve that. So it's over to you, Michael.
Okay, Colm. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning. I'm going to give a quick summary of Ryanair's position on carbon. Ryanair is Europe's greenest, cleanest major airline. Currently, we have the lowest carbon emissions per passenger kilometre of any large European airline at 66 grams per passenger kilometre. That's less than half what's being produced by Lufthansa, Air France, KLM and BA. So people are already making a conscious decision when flying Ryanair to reduce their carbon footprint. We're not content, though, with being best in class. We want to go further. We're currently investing more than $20 billion in a fleet of new technology aircraft we're taking from Boeing over the next 5 years. These aircraft, the Boeing MAX Game Changers, have 4% more seats. They burn 16% less fuel, 16% lower CO2 emissions, and just as important, particularly at Europe's airports, 40% less noise. We're not stopping there. We're sponsoring research with Trinity College, designed around research and development in producing sustainable aviation fuels in greater volume between now and 2030. The Commission has, in my view, set an ambitious objective of getting to 5% of sustainable aviation fuels over the next 5 years. In Ryanair, we want to go further. So we've set an even more challenging objective of getting to 12.5% over that period of time. Throughout our entire organisation, we're continuously looking at new ways of reducing, making flying more environmentally friendly. We've committed to going plastic-free on board our aircraft and in all of our offices by 2025. We're already 80% of the way there. We expect to get there in 2020, at the end of 2023. And we're also the first airline in Europe which on a monthly basis publishes our carbon disclosure. We publish our carbon emissions on a monthly basis, the first European airline to do so. So Ryanair is doing not just best in class in Europe, we're going further, faster than any other airline. We're investing more money, not just in new technology aircraft, in sustainable aviation fuels, and in ensuring that people can continue to fly across Europe at the lowest fares, but with the smallest possible impact on the environment. And one last concluding point I'd make. One of the things we need to bring into this debate, though, is European integration and how we make it easier for our citizens to move from the periphery of Europe to the centre. I continue to kind of criticise policy documents that are largely being produced by the Central European economies, the Dutch, the Germans and the French, many of whom do have an alternative, taking trains or motorways to get where they want around Europe. I live in Ireland. We're an island on the periphery of Europe. The Greeks, the Maltese, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Balearics and the Canaries. We have to have low-cost air access to the centre of Europe. The same for our Central and Eastern European colleagues in Poland and Romania. For those economies to develop, it's critically important that we continue to offer them low-fare air travel, but in an environmentally sustainable way. So I think we need a rounder debate here, not just about going green, but how do we, particularly post-Brexit, how do we as an economic system go green, but in a way that still allows our people, particularly the periphery of Europe, to continue to connect with and travel to the centre and back again. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I think that sums up really where we're at here today in terms of if we're in the middle of COP26 and if we have a target of 63% reduction by 2050, How can we do that, taking account of all the, if you like, unintended consequences that may occur or scenarios that have to be taken into account? Next up, we've Stephen Dooley, from a physics professor from Trinity College Dublin, who very much will talk to us about this idea of what it'll take to go green.
Yes, thank you, Colm. Thank you for the invitation. So yes, my name is Stephen Dooley. I'm from the School of Physics at Trinity College Dublin. And we've been researching in sustainable aviation for a number of years. So we'll just take you through a little bit about what that problem entails. Sustainability is the act of being able to continue something over a long period of time. So that's what our goal is. And for aviation, that means sustainability of environment. It means sustainability of noise in that sense, but also CO2 emissions and other pollutants. We know that as we try to scale sustainable aviation fuels, that there's going to be a price premium on those things. And so how that transmits into passenger demand with an elevated cost base is really the circle that we're trying to square. So our research is about improving technology efficiencies at the aircraft, but then also about the massive deployment of sustainable aviation fuels. So recently, in the last 6 months, we've received a generous partnership agreement with Ryanair. They're supporting us on 3 research topics. So the first is led by my colleague, Professor Stephen Spence, and that's around advanced propulsion concepts, new energy vectors such as hydrogen and electrification, and how those can be conducted into the sustainable aviation picture over a long period of time. These are probably solutions for the 20, 30-year period rather than the 10-year period we're facing now. The other aspect of work is noise reduction and modelling measures to improve the local sustainability of aviation in the areas around airports. And then today, obviously, as Colm has said, in the context of Fit for 55, the focus is on sustainable aviation fuels. So this is our big thrust, really, and the reason for that is for technical and safety reasons. Aviation must use liquid hydrocarbon fuels for propulsion. And that means the production of CO2 necessarily. So what really matters is where that carbon is coming from. So not all molecules of carbon dioxide are equal. So our first thrust is looking into the sustainability of SAF candidates, so sustainable aviation fuel candidates. So we're working on improved rigor and specificity on life cycle analysis, so understanding how much embodied carbon dioxide is involved in the production of SAFs, and using that information then to optimize supply chains so that we can have the lowest amount of CO2 embodied in our energy carriers as is possible. The Fit for 55 proposals actually by 2050 call for 63% share of SAF in sustainable aviation. And we're a long way away from that at the current time. And one of the barriers there is the regulation barrier on the certification of sustainable aviation fuels, which right now are only permitted to be used at 50% blending levels. So we're also doing work on certification of the SAF candidates at very small volumes to allow for this local energy infrastructure and community-based fuel production systems, ecosystems to be produced. So then maybe just a picture about, on the final slide there, of where we need to go. So I think it's really important that we appreciate the interconnectivity of the energy system. So if we're to do anything, we're going to have huge amounts of renewable energy coming from electricity, and that can be converted from hydrogen and from there into SAFs and other road transportation fuels. But we really need to get going on this quite urgently. And the picture there on the bottom right shows that today we're using less than 0.05% SAF in our aviation fuel mix, and there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done to get up that hill. So this is about removing barriers to entry, making the energy carriers as cheap as we possibly can. We know that there's going to be a price premium on them, so we need massive scaling of R&D. So the concept that I'm talking about, so sponsored by Ryanair now, but also by our Science Foundation Ireland and the European Research Council in my laboratory, is this idea of a SAF knowledge house. So a venue to conduct all of this knowledge generation and hopefully deploy that into the market so that we can walk up this sharp ramp that we have to do in terms of new energy carriers.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I think that sets a bit of context. If we're only at 0.05% SAF at this stage, then we really have a massive challenge to undertake. Next up, we have Damien Meadows from the Commission. He's head of international carbon markets for aviation and maritime. So, Damien, it's over to you.
Thank you, Colm, and thank you for this very timely debate. I think I'll concentrate on 3 points. I mean, we're talking during COP26, and it's great to see the global recognition of the urgency of tackling climate change. I've worked on these issues for most of the last 20 years, and we're heading towards a catastrophic situation. You see this from the forest fires in Greece and Turkey this summer, from the IPCC report, and you need to take action. Now, Europe's a market economy, and it's best to use market forces here because entrepreneurs like Michael know far better how to run a company than any bureaucrat will do. So what Europe's done is an approach that was initially favoured by John McCain in the United States. And you see Bill Gates calling for this, Elon Musk, Pope Francis. Across the political board, you need to make a market case to move towards sustainable aviation fuels, to have more efficient operations, to retrofit aircraft and so on. And this is done in Europe through pricing carbon. Ursula von der Leyen was very clear when she became Commission President that you need to put a price on pollution and all sectors need to contribute. And so Ryanair, I mean, you're a high load factor airline, you have new aircraft, you have efficient aircraft. This is exactly what a carbon price encourages you compared to your less efficient competitors. And it also encourages sustainable aviation fuel. The ETS today gives a price incentive of €200 per tonne directly for using every single tonne of sustainable aviation fuel. Because when I see that figure of 1/20th of 1% for actual deployment, when I see the past history of IATA goals for sustainable aviation fuel deployment, it's never reached a fraction of those levels. It's over 100 times short of the level of targets. So we need incentives to get there. And what's crucial for these incentives is equal treatment on routes. Now, railways have been in the EU emission trading system since 2005. Aviation came in 2012. It initially covered long-haul flights as well, but from 2013 to 2024, it's only covering short-haul flights. I fully recognise this means Ryanair is contributing from almost all its activity, whereas transatlantic flights are not contributing to the same degree. This is one of the issues which the Parliament and Council are looking at in the Fit for 55 context. But within Europe, I mean, this ETS system is working. It's delivered significant reductions across half of Europe's economy: power, steel, cement, chemicals. Aviation was increasing, of course, until coronavirus hit us. But it's giving the incentives for companies who are investing in the solutions of the future. My third point and final point is carbon pricing produces revenues, and how those revenues are spent matters. I can confirm that Ireland, in a report published 2 weeks ago, confirms that Ireland uses 100% of the revenues from the ETS to tackle climate change. Many other member states are the same, but on average, I think it's 3/4 of the money is reported as being used to tackle climate change. In Fit for 55, the Commission is proposing to make this obligation stronger, but it's also proposing to expand an existing innovation fund that we have for the breakthrough technologies of the future. Europe is good on research and technical development, but in terms of commercial deployment, that's where the valley of death exists, in terms of the front runners need support to build the infrastructure to get widespread deployment. And this is precisely what the ETS Innovation Fund is aimed for. Today, it's supporting Rome Airport for the deployment of batteries to balance solar power. It's supporting the carbon removal projects that you maybe saw in the media in Iceland. And it has the potential to support companies like Ryanair and fuel suppliers massively for the commercial deployment of, say, electrofuels or the most sustainable fuels, but also in terms of retrofitting, in terms of improvement to aircraft. The general emissions trading approach has been to support all technologies. I've seen Wizz Air has been quite dismissive of SAF as the way forward. They are also an efficient airline. And the approach of Europe over the last 2 decades has been to use pricing and allow companies and entrepreneurs to find the solutions that work, and to do this then cost effectively for the economy as a whole, because it is a massive challenge to address climate change, and we have to work, I think, with economics if we are to have a chance of limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Damien. And I think, look, there's a number of questions that have come up, I suppose, in relation to hitting targets of renewable fuels is probably the one we'll touch on first. I think equally the emissions trading and, if you like, the use of finances, carbon-generated finances, what you can do with them as well. But we'll go back to the initial point. If you like, we're currently at 100th of our target in terms of renewable fuel. The target is 5%. We're at 1/20th of 1%. So that's 100th of our current targets. I know Ryanair have set a more ambitious target, say 5% in Europe by 2030. Ryanair's target, I think, is 12%. So I'll turn over to you, Michael. How do you intend to deliver on that 12% by 2030?
Yeah, I think, Colm, we need intensive investment in research, which is why we're working with Trinity College, Stephen and his team. I mean, the challenges in producing SAFs are, one, the cost of SAFs. I mean, Damien rightly made the point. You know, the Commission is subsidising SAFs to the tune of €200 a tonne. The problem is today, the cost of a tonne of SAF is about €3,000. A tonne of kerosene is about €85. So a €200 subsidy gets us nowhere near the subsidising the cost of those alternative fuels. Stephen's point is correct. We need, as an industry, and I think this is where much more of the income that's being taken from airlines like Ryanair, we spent 630 million in 2019 pre-COVID on environmental taxes. Some of it, the ETS, gets routed back to national governments, but most of it, like UK APD, German APD, is just trousered by the finance minister of those countries. We need more money to be spent, not just on the research. We've got to develop much greater volume of SAF production. Also, the logistics. How do we store or get that SAF to airports, and how do we store it at airports? Because currently, not alone can we not produce that volume of SAF, we logistically can't get it to airports and get it into plane. Now, I do believe we will move towards 5, 10, I hope we'll see 12% of our fuel use. It'll be blended using SAF by 2030, but nobody should underestimate it's a Herculean challenge to get SAFs from currently $3,000 a tonne down to jet kerosene, which is $85 a tonne. And, you know, with the greatest respect to Damien, a €200 subsidy isn't going to do it. If you ask the people of Europe to pay the current market price for sustainable aviation fuel, nobody will fly, except the rich people who will be flying long haul, who are bizarrely exempt from these the market price of carbon. It is simply unacceptable as a European citizen that the very rich people, the Chinese, the Russians and the Americans, can fly in and out of here, pay no ETS, and yet the poor people in Europe who live in the regions of the peripheral countries are expected to shoulder all this burden. It's deeply unfair. It needs to be reformed.
Stephen, I suppose the question is, if we have that 100th of the requirement for 2030, clearly the pricing has demonstrated that the supply is not there. How do we deliver on supply of these renewable fuels?
Yes, I mean, this is a complex question, right? So this needs a lot of work. So there's a few things there. The target to 2030 is 5%. As that we're going to take the highest grade feedstock and convert it into SAF for that one.
What's the proposal?
So this is the point. So there are different types of SAF, right? So we maybe need to start changing our language a little bit. So initially it's going to be HEFA. After that, we're hoping for alcohol to jet. We're hoping for fuels.
You say HEFA for the ordinary punter on the street?
I beg your pardon. So hydrogenated esters and fatty acids. It's hydrogenated biodiesel oil.
Sorry you asked now.
Yeah, lipid. That's one of the simple ones, right? But that's the best, nearest to fuel feedstock that we have, and we're going to deploy that in aviation for the first 10 years. After that, what are we going to do?
What is the source for that now?
Lipids and used cooking oil, principally.
Used cooking oil. I think that relates.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do we do after that? So we're hoping to get up to 63% by 2050. About half of that projection is from a fuel that we don't know how to make yet, right? We haven't demonstrated that we can make it at scale, and that's the use of renewable electricity to convert water and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into fuel. So those are big steps. One realization maybe is a €200 per tonne subsidy. This is good. You know, it pushes things along a little bit. We can hope for an economy of scale to collapse the price of SAF down to Jet A. But due to the less high quality nature of the feedstock, the price of SAF is never going to be equal to that of Jet A unless something changes in the oil market.
It needs to be supported.
There's going to be a price differential. So we need R&D investment on doing that. We need to start working on consumer demand and start to tell them, to be honest, a little bit more realistic message on what we're doing here and how challenging it is to put an aircraft in the air. And then some supports, of course.
Michael, sorry, before I go any further, just to remind the audience, you're welcome to put in questions to us at any stage so that we'll ask all the various panellists of them. So please put your questions in the chat and we'll come to them in a few minutes. Michael, in relation to that longer term target, the 63% by 2050, can we achieve that? That surely is a whole different generation of different types of fuels. How can that be achieved? The idea of cooking oil won't do it.
I mean, by 2050, it allows also for further technological development, research and on new engine technology, new, airframe technology.
So are we talking hydrogen? Are we talking ammonia? Are we talking plant-based?
Nobody's quite sure yet. I mean, at this point in time within the industry, we think we're looking at more hybridization of propulsion systems, part electric, you'll have more electric propulsion systems. But fundamentally, based on the technology we have at the moment, it's still going to be jet fuel propulsion in those systems. Certainly between now and 2030, there's going to be no new technological developments. But I mean, I would be optimistic, both in terms of the development and supply of SAFs, and also new technology propulsion systems in engine and aircraft will dramatically alter those ambitious objectives by 2050. And Ryanair will be to the forefront in investing in those new technologies and bringing them to market.
I just have a question that's just come in there from Alan Dukes, no less. He says if you reduce the cost or the impact, the carbon per kilometre by 2%, but increase the passengers by 5%, ultimately that's a net increase. So I think that puts in context the level of scale we have to reduce by.
Yeah, but I think he's missing the point. As Ryanair continues to grow, as we create more routes and more operations across Europe, we're not moving people from we're taking passengers or growing new markets where we're taking people off very inefficient, carbon inefficient airlines like Lufthansa, Air France, KLM, Iberia, Alitalia, moving them to new technology aircraft on Ryanair, and they are reducing the carbon footprint of their journey by more than 50%.
But I suppose the opponent to this would suggest maybe we need to fly less planes, maybe we need to fly less airlines.
Except like that, the challenge is going to be, if you live on an island like Ireland, or you live in Crete, or you live in Malta, you live in Cyprus, you live in on the periphery of Europe, in Poland, in Romania, you need to get across Europe for work, for life. The idea that we just fly less, and take for us for the Irish, we'd all sit at home and do what? It's not an acceptable response from the environmental movement that we all fly less, because some of us don't have a choice. We don't have an alternative transport system.
So you think that regional areas like Ireland, like Cyprus, could be negatively impacted by...
There's no doubt they're being negatively impacted at the moment. I mean, tourism in Greece, in Portugal, the Canaries, the Balearics are being negatively damaged by the disproportionate environmental tax burden that's put on short-haul European air travel, while the very long-haul flights operated, generally taken by the richest in our society, are completely exempt from these environmental taxes. I think there needs to be more equity, particularly if we're going to continue to invest in the regions and the peripheral economies of Europe.
And as regards Central Europe, I suppose people at the centre would argue that maybe on the continent that rail offers an equal opportunity as much as aviation.
Rail is certainly an attractive alternative, but only over very short distances. I mean, Madrid, Barcelona, Rome, Milan, London, Paris, London, Brussels. Rail is at least an attractive environmental alternative. Now, the fact is, rail is vastly more expensive for consumers than air travel. I can fly you for $9.99 across Europe. You won't get a rail fare anywhere for those kind of prices. But rail on very short sectors is an alternative. The problem with the people, though, particularly in the centre of Europe, who advocate that is it doesn't address how do you get Romanians, allow them to travel around Europe? How do we allow the Polish, the Irish, the Maltese to travel around Europe? We don't have a rail alternative, and nor can we cycle to Brussels.
But essentially, I think that brings the point, like, we have to find a solution for long-term aviation. I know, Damien, in terms of, like, one thing that carbon taxes bring is revenue. How do you see that the revenue that's generated by carbon taxes can be used by Europe to do the research so that aviation can continue to be a part of our future?
Sure. I mean, this is where I would reiterate that, I mean, the ETS has raised revenue. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose of carbon pricing is to reduce emissions, and it's done so effectively, but it does raise revenue. Over time, and this started with Avril Doyle as the rapporteur in Parliament. The Parliament's been insistent that this money be used to tackle climate change. Currently, that's done at national level, thanks to, in part, to the United Kingdom. I mean, it's not a legal obligation. It's a statement that member states should use this money to tackle climate change. That's more than you have for APD in any case.
It's true.
And so countries like Ireland do use 100% in practice to tackle climate change. I don't think Ireland has a big aerospace industry that's going to, so it's going in other areas. Now, at the European level, our door is open for this innovation fund with over 20 billion euros to massively fund commercial deployment. So I totally agree, 200 euros isn't enough. Biden's Build Back Better legislative proposal, this would give a subsidy, I think, of $250 per tonne to using alternative fuels. So that's similar to what Europe has, but it's still not enough. We have this idea, I think, originally from John McCain, where if it's costing you 1,000, 2,000 euros per tonne, the ETS can support that through a so-called contract for difference. Now, I don't think that can be for 50 years that there would be that level of support, because it wouldn't be fair towards other sectors. But to get it happening now in this decade, the start of next decade, that is in the Commission's proposal to the Parliament, and it's really now up to the Parliament and the Member States to try and get this in place as soon as possible, and in a way that doesn't discourage first movers, because when you try to spend state money, there is the risk of doing it wrong. That's why carbon pricing makes sense, because companies decide on the allocation of resources. But this support is there if the aviation industry wants it, and it just needs people to come forward and also shape the legislation to get that commercial rollout. Because when I look at the figure of 1/20%, then it's hard to take some of these targets credibly for use of sustainable aviation fuels.
I think this is the point. If we're at 1/20th of 1% to get to 5%, I'll come back to you again, Michael, on the same point. Can we fly our planes if we're only at that percentage at the moment? Is the long-term answer to find renewable fuels? Where are we going to find them? And if we don't, what is the outlook?
I'm always worried when we start focusing on the long term and we omit the short term. What happens in the short term is we need to build up the amount of sustainable aviation fuels that we all use as European airlines and for European citizens. I come back to Damien's point. He speaks very well about, well, we're using market pricing. The reality is Europe is we don't use market pricing because we exempt the long-haul airlines account for 56% of European aviation emissions, and they pay zero. We subsidise the richest, the most polluting airlines who pay no burden at all, and yet we penalise the most efficient airlines operating on short haul across Europe. If Europe was really serious about doing something immediately in the short term, you'd address the single European sky. The greatest bane of every traveller's life in Europe is air traffic control delays, and we have this bizarre system of 35 different air traffic control centres all over Europe. It is one of the most inefficient systems in the world. The Americans have 3. It accounts for about 90% of airline delays across Europe. And if you eliminated that system and moved to a single European sky with much more direct routings, we, the airlines, and our customers would save between 10 and 20% of the fuel burden, and we'd reduce emissions immediately by 20%. Much more important than any market pricing or fundamentally crooked market pricing system that's presently operated in Europe. But Europe won't tackle the single European sky. They've been messing about with it for 20 years.
That's what I was just going to say.
About
it's
it
there for
and taking no action.
It's 20 years on the go. I think it's been identified that 10% of all emissions are related to single skies.
Directly. Flight delays and stacking.
What has to be done in order to resolve the single skies issues? For those who don't understand, the routes around Europe, there's certain areas blocked off, and there's traffic control issues as well that amount to an inefficiency in the flying of our planes across Europe. And there's been an initiative that's 20 years old at this stage to adopt a single skies model, which opens up the skies to the whole of Europe for the most efficient routes around Europe. But it's on the go 20 years, Michael. Why has it not been delivered in 20 years? What are the issues?
It's not been delivered because air traffic control systems are provided by government-owned monopolies, which have very powerful unions and government inability to challenge those unions. We do have a central mechanism which is operated by Eurocontrol for route management and also for charging. Eurocontrol should be developed as the operator of all those systems, and they should have the freedom to move air traffic control provision between system providers. The challenge in Europe is, as usual, we want to create a multilateral monopoly, which is we'll have one big single European system that will have the inefficiencies of French air traffic control and the high cost of Spanish air traffic control. Instead of saying the technology has moved beyond national air traffic control providers, we should actually make them compete against each other in the same way the airlines do. So Eurocontrol can operate and procure more efficient air traffic control system provision in France, allocated to the French. If the Irish will do it cheaper, allocated to the Irish, and pass those savings on. And they will be real financial savings to passengers. They'll also be environmental savings, huge fuel reduction. It needs to be challenged, but it's never going to be done because Europe is a talking shop of inefficiency when it comes to dealing with air traffic control.
Damien, what can we do at European level to make this happen?
Nothing.
I want it to happen as well. I mean, I guess one of the issues here is Europe is 30 countries working together. So it has its challenges. It's colleagues of mine who work on that. I mean, from 2005, we've had a single European carbon price. It's the same for Olympic, for Lufthansa and so on. And I understand, I mean, our climate action is very business friendly in terms of working for the most efficient. It's colleagues who are working on the single European sky. All I can say is it's difficult as 30. I mean, it's also difficult in the COP, you know, trying as 180 countries also with Saudi Arabia and so on to get common approaches. So Europe is doing what it can as 30, but can it do better? Certainly it can. I'm not going to disagree.
I think the issue is, could it do any worse? And the honest answer is probably not. I mean, we have the bizarre situation that when the French go on strike, they will close not just the French air traffic control, but also the overflights. And France being geographically in the centre of Europe, it means all of our flights across Europe have to go around French airspace just because those guys go on strike. They wouldn't be allowed to close the railways, they wouldn't be allowed to close the motorways of Europe, yet they're allowed to close the skies over what is allegedly a single European marketplace.
I think
it needs to be tackled, and it hasn't been.
In fairness, of let's say the 3 or 4 key points that are out there, certainly a single European skies, to get that 10% efficiency is vital. Yep. Another point that has come up here from a question from Tom Fox, and I'll maybe go to you first on this, Stephen, is the role of peripheral airports. In the context of, let's say, renewable fuels, is there an opportunity there in maybe peripheral regions? But equally, could they have a niche position in relation to, let's say, the use of these renewable fuels? I think one of the key points about the infrastructure, about the availability of renewable fuels, is to have the infrastructure in place in critical mass in the various airports. So is that an opportunity for regional airports to put that infrastructure in place first and let them be the ones that are using that fuel?
There certainly is. And I mean, I think the overall theme here is about efficiencies. And so what we want to be able to do in terms of energy supply is source that locally and deliver it locally to airports at that scale, if that's possible. So incentivizing local fuel producers to avoid, having to truck fuels from large distribution centres to large airports. That's certainly an opportunity. The research that we're doing will remove regulation barriers in terms of certification towards the deployment of small-scale fuel producers and start to build this, hub and spoke activity of local fuel producer, local airports. So I think that's certainly a thing that we need to do. The driver for all of that is going to be looking at the overall life cycle greenhouse gas intensity of the activity itself, right? So the shorter the supply chain we can make, the less carbon intensive that's going to be. So, in terms of the Fit for 55 proposals, there's a discussion over a volume-based mandate or a greenhouse gas intensity-based mandate. And certainly the latter one there, the greenhouse gas intensity mandate, is the one that will allow for the driver of innovation. So certainly, lots of opportunities for new fuel producers to enter the fray. We've got to work on removing the barriers, though.
Thank you. And just to come back to some of the questions that are coming in, I suppose it's coming back to that rail versus flights argument. But I get this now. Umberto Gambini has asked a question. If you leave the islands out, has rail a role on the continent of Europe? I think it's coming back to that question. I don't know, Michael, if you have a comment on that?
You can't leave the islands out, but rail has, rail has a role, to answer the question, but rail has a role typically on journeys, ground journeys of 200-300 kilometres. That will cover less than, 20% of European journeys. I mean, it's simply not an alternative. You're not going to go by rail from Warsaw to Lisbon. You're not going to go from rail from Lamezia in the south of Italy to, I think, Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain. Europe cannot function unless our people can travel around, not just for work, but for leisure, visit friends and family. And that can only be done on low-cost air access. Rail is, despite being heavily subsidised, is very expensive. But it is an alternative on very short journeys.
If we went for high-speed rail, it may have a position. But anyway,
it won't.
If we move along to I suppose, emissions trading scheme, I think that was mentioned by Damien at the start in relation to it being a key part. And I think you said, Michael, ultimately, a phrase I often say, if people pay their taxes and go on holidays, half the world that have the money can pay taxes and go on holidays, while the other half go without. Is ETS the solution? And how, if it is the solution, how do we make it work?
I don't think ETS is the solution. I mean, the difficulty with ETS, and Damien makes the point, the money goes back to the Irish government, but we don't see any of it. We're investing 20 million in new technology. It goes to the Environmental Protection Agency in Ireland. What do they do with it? Nobody's any idea. It's just a big bureaucratic
Stephen, maybe you could come in at that. How can we use this money effectively? You're in the research business.
Yeah.
How can we use it for research to actually find these new aviation fuels we need for the next generation?
Yeah, so there's a number of things, right? So there's a lot of R&D is needed here. One overall point that I'll make, about this rail versus aviation debate, we shouldn't discount the leadership role of aviation as a very technologically innovative business in terms of propagating solutions to other sectors, right? So we've been working in renewable fuels for many years. The biggest piece of boosting that we've had in recent years is the attention of the aviation industry, right? That's really pushed us along the road. And those solutions propagate, you mentioned ammonia, hydrogen, into ground transportation, into power generation. So that's really important that aviation are on board with us for renewable fuels. In terms of R&D tasks that we need to do, I mean, if you look at the techno-economic analysis for any sustainable aviation fuel, feedstocks are a huge cost, all right? So meeting the Fit for 55 target is going to involve about a doubling of different biomass, biological-based feedstocks, and those come in different categories, okay? So for the least carbon-intensive lignocellulosic biofuels, we need a lot of R&D there. That is at like technology readiness levels 4, 5, 6. So we need basic R&D propagating into demonstration facilities there. And so that's really important. And then the second thing is just the overall efficiency of the conversion process. Everything is really predicated on using renewable electricity. That needs to continue to be deployed, but then we have to look at the conversion processes, using that renewable electricity, and really optimizing those and getting those working as efficiently as possible. So that's basic R&D. So this is what we need.
Damien, do you wish to comment on how we should use that money?
Well, I mean, you're the Parliament with the Council. Please use that money effectively to solve the problem. That's, I mean, the Commission is proposing this innovation fund that can support the cost of electrofuels, hydrogen-derived aviation fuels, and it just requires industry to come forward, I think, and engage and ask for this. In terms of what Stephen said on propagating solutions, if I can say a word, because, I mean, aviation, despite even the non-CO2 climate effects, it's still only 5% of the climate change problem. The other 95%, counting the non-CO2 impacts, though, which SAF will reduce. But in terms of propagating solutions, China has just put in place an emissions trading system twice the size of Europe's, and it's learned from the European experience. The Chinese intend their system to cover aviation in time. Right now, it's the power sector, because we can't solve climate change as Europe alone. And the spreading of carbon pricing to China, I think, is hugely important. But also then examples, if we're able to use the money to get these alternative fuels deployed, to get retrofitting, to get other solutions in place, then we will see others follow. I mean, the United States is trying to do this. It has its challenges. I think Europe's been roughly going the right direction with this. I agree with Michael on long-haul flights are in a much favoured position compared to the short-haul flights. So you can write a book on that. I've actually written a book with colleagues that we can share with you.
But that is one of the challenges. How can Europe, like it applies to other sectors. I have a background in agriculture, it applies to that sector too. How can we ensure that the standards that we want in Europe reflect in standards across the world? Because ultimately we will disadvantage internal European transport if we do not get this to affect the world at large. And surely that's what COP26 is about. So how do we go about ensuring, I'll come across all three, we've only just got 5 minutes left. I think two key questions. How do we make this affect the world at large? And how do we ultimately find the next generation? If we go to 2050, by 2050, we want 63% of our renewable fuels to be, our fuel to be renewable. How do we make that happen? What's it going to look like in 2050? That's a question I would have for you. So we'll work our way around. Damien first.
So, I mean, to do this by 2050 is a huge challenge. We only have 30 years. I mean, I worked on the ratification of Kyoto in Europe. I mean, you can do this all at UN level. We saw the problems with Kyoto when others didn't sign up to it. So it can also be done as a group of 30 countries influencing others. As I've said, I mean, Europe's influenced China here. We need meaningful price incentives and support and subsidies to get these things deployed very, very fast. I mean, we're not on track. It can be done. But I think more will be done in this building in the European Parliament for the 30 countries of Europe than we'll get specifically in the area of aviation from the Glasgow COP.
Michael, have you any thoughts on how we get the rest of the world to have the same ambition?
Well, first thing, Europe needs to put its own house in order. I mean, the first and the two initiatives that need to be tackled starting today is we need to bring the long-haul airlines into the ETS trading scheme in Europe. It is a scandal that they are exempt from paying their contribution when they account for 56% of European aviation's emissions. The second one I would do is it is a scandal which the European Parliament and Commission are responsible for, that we don't have a single European sky in Europe. It should be introduced. It should be introduced in the next 12 months. It needs some radical action. And that alone would reduce fuel consumption in European aviation by between 10 and 20%. It would be dramatic, the impact or the improvement it would have on flight times, on the cost of flying, and on reducing the carbon footprint of European aviation. Then, once Europe's got its own house in order, let's lecture the rest of the world. But let's get our own house in order first.
Stephen, have you any comment?
Yes, I mean, from my point of view, there'll be two broad things to drive innovation. One is that we focus on efficient processes and always drive for a high efficiency, low greenhouse gas life cycle footprint, end to end, okay? So from well to wake or field to wake. This is the first thing. If that process works, that solution can be exported, all right? And then we start to influence the agendas of other jurisdictions. And then the second thing, to enable all of that, it's really, I think, about fundamentally generating demand at the consumer level. So educating the consumers, start telling them a little bit about what's involved here, like we're doing now, and start to understand that it's going to be tougher. There's a level of urgency. So we need the commitment of everybody using our energy system. So those would be the two things.
Can I just come back? We've only got 2 minutes left, so I'll just come back to two of the questions that I see here. Kevin McPartland, who is a CEO of Fuels for Ireland, says all we're ultimately going to do is divert fuels from other, let's say it be heating or other transports, into aviation. That ultimately, I think the problem here is we need more renewable fuels. Michael, how can we deliver on more renewable fuels?
More research and development in tech, more of the kind of research and development that Stephen and his team in Trinity College are pioneering. It's the only way we're going to get there is technological innovation, and that comes from increasing our investment as an industry and from the European Union in R&D.
And I suppose it just comes to the other question, and maybe Michelle Mulhern from Mayo, I think, has asked the question of ultimately, is it not a case, if we cannot find the fuels, do we have to look at less flights? That's her question. I come back to you, Michael, because clearly it's central.
No, you're not going to look at less flights. I think the future of European integration, particularly post-Brexit, is going to be more flying within the European community, continuing to reduce the cost of that flying, and bringing Europe closer together by making the peripheral more accessible to the centre and vice versa. Low-cost flying is the way forward. It's going to be cheaper and more efficient than travelling by train across Europe, which will be high cost and still inefficient.
So I think we've just got 30 seconds left. So I'll just thank my three guests, Michael O'Leary, Stephen Dooley and Damien Meadows, for their contributions. I think it boils down to 2 or 3 key points here. We need to focus on the single skies to take out that 10% of emissions that is singularly responsible for. Equally, we need to look at ETS if it's to be the way forward, how is that money invested, be it in subsidising renewable fuels or in the research to deliver on those renewable fuels? And ultimately, we need to deliver on a supply of renewable fuels that can make aviation possible into the future. So I'd like to thank my three guests again for a very interesting debate. I wish we had more time, but sadly, we're out of time. So thank you very much, you the guests as well, for all the questions that came in. Thank you.